December 24, 1944, Hürtgen Forest, Germany. The forest had no color left. Everything, the shattered pines, the frozen mud, the sky itself, existed in shades of gray and black. In a half-collapsed bunker that smelled of cordite and gangrene, 23-year-old Gefreiter Friedrich Becker pressed his back against concrete that wept with ice and tried to remember what warmth felt like. His stomach had stopped growling 3 days ago. That was worse than the hunger pangs. It meant his body was beginning to consume itself, that the machine was shutting down. Outside, the sound of American artillery had become so constant it was almost rhythmic, a metal heartbeat that marked time better than any clock. Inside, 6 men who had once been soldiers now resembled something else, hollowed-out versions of themselves, their uniforms hanging loose, their eyes enormous in shrunken faces, their hands trembling from something beyond cold. On the floor between them sat their last meal, a can of preserved beets, frozen solid. They had discussed eating it raw, chipping at it with bayonets, but decided to wait. For what, none of them could articulate. Perhaps for a miracle. Perhaps for an ending. Becker's hands were wrapped in newspaper, pages from the Völkischer Beobachter proclaiming final victory, because his gloves had disintegrated weeks ago. The irony was not lost on him. He was using propaganda as insulation against reality. Then, through the mechanical thunder of the barrage, a different sound. Footsteps, American voices, the universal language of click-clack as rifle bolts were pulled back. The 6 men looked at each other with a kind of exhausted resignation. This, then, was the ending they had been waiting for. But what came through that bunker entrance was not what Friedrich Becker expected. And what happened in the next 4 hours would fracture something fundamental in his understanding of who was human and who was not. To comprehend the significance of what occurred in that frozen German bunker, you must first understand the architecture of dehumanization that both sides had constructed. War does not merely kill bodies, it kills empathy. It must, because empathy makes killing impossible. The German soldier had been conditioned for years to see his enemies not as individuals but as ideological categories. The Americans were Terrorrenflieger terror bombers, who destroyed German cities and murdered women and children. They were the tools of Jewish capitalism, spiritually empty, fighting for nothing but material gain. They were racial mongrels, a degenerate mixture of bloodlines that made them inherently inferior to the pure Germanic warrior. This conditioning was not accidental. It was systematic, embedded in every propaganda film, every training lecture, every speech by party officials. The dehumanization worked both ways. American soldiers had been shown films of concentration camps, had heard stories of SS atrocities, had been taught that the German soldier was either a fanatical Nazi or a willing accomplice to genocide. The enemy was not Friedrich Becker, a former apprentice carpenter from Wurzburg who had been drafted in 1942 and wanted nothing more than to survive long enough to see his daughter, who had been born while he was in France and whom he had never held. The enemy was the German, an abstract entity that wore a gray uniform and fought for Hitler. You could kill an abstraction. You could not kill a man with a daughter. But something happened when the abstractions met face to face, when the machinery of war broke down enough that individual human beings had to confront individual human beings. And nowhere was this confrontation more visceral, more immediate, more transformative than around food. The American soldiers who entered that bunker were from Easy Company, 2nd Battalion, 109th Infantry Regiment. They were part of the force grinding through the Hürtgen Forest in what would become known as one of the bloodiest battles the U.S. Army fought in Europe. A brutal, attritional nightmare that cost 33,000 American casualties for gains measured in yards. These were not fresh-faced recruits. They were exhausted, traumatized men who had been fighting since Normandy, who had seen their friends torn apart by artillery, who had every reason to hate the Germans with a pure and simple hatred. The squad leader was a staff sergeant named Frank Kozlowski, a Polish-American from Pittsburgh, whose grandparents had fled Europe to escape the same German militarism that had now dragged the world into its second total war in a generation. Kozlowski entered the bunker with his M1 Garand raised, expecting resistance. What he found instead were 6 scarecrows in Wehrmacht uniforms, their hands already raised, their weapons stacked in the corner, their faces expressing not defiance but something closer to relief. Standard procedure was clear. Disarm them, search them, send them to the rear for processing. The war was nearly won. Germany was collapsing. These prisoners represented no threat, just administrative paperwork, but it was Christmas Eve. And Kozlowski noticed something that made him pause. One of the Germans, the young one with the newspaper wrapped around his hands, was staring at Kozlowski's backpack with an expression that transcended nationality. It was the look of a starving man watching someone eat. It was a look Kozlowski had seen before, in his grandfather's eyes when the old man talked about the famines in occupied Poland during the First World War. What happened next violated several army regulations. Kozlowski told his men to watch the prisoners. Then he opened his pack and removed his K-ration, the standard American combat ration. 3 boxes, each containing a can of meat, crackers, chocolate, instant coffee, sugar, cigarettes, and chewing gum. Together, approximately 3,000 calories, plus luxury items that had no combat utility but represented something else. Abundance, surplus, the casual wealth of a nation that could afford to ship candy to its soldiers in the field. Kozlowski opened the can of ham and eggs. Steam rose from it. The chemical heating element in the K-ration actually worked, even in freezing temperatures. The smell filled the bunker. It was not a pleasant smell, objectively speaking. K-ration ham and eggs was notoriously unappetizing. American soldiers complained about it constantly. But to 6 men who had not eaten real protein in a week, who had subsisted on frozen beets and ersatz bread mixed with sawdust, that smell was transcendent. It was the smell of life itself. Kozlowski looked at the German prisoners. They looked back at him. And in that moment, something unspoken passed between them, a recognition that the boundaries that separated enemy from enemy were thinner than the ones that separated the fed from the starving, the warm from the frozen, the living from the dying. He handed the can to Friedrich Becker. The historical record contains thousands of similar moments, scattered across memoirs and after-action reports and interviews conducted decades later, when old men felt safe enough to admit what they had done. In January 1945, American soldiers near Bastogne shared their rations with German prisoners who were frostbitten and starving. In February, during the drive to the Rhine, a first lieutenant named James Crawford documented giving his entire squad's chocolate ration to captured Hitlerjugend boys, teenagers, really, some as young as 15, who had been thrown into the line without adequate supplies. In March, as American forces crossed into Germany proper, a recurring pattern emerged. German soldiers, even those still armed and capable of fighting, would approach American lines with their hands raised, calling out not "Kamerad" but "Brat," bread. The word appears again and again in the accounts. Brat *, bread, the most basic human need, stripped of all ideological content. You could not eat racial superiority. You could not sustain yourself on promises of final victory. The German soldier in the final months of the war was fighting on a logistical system that had completely collapsed. By December 1944, the Wehrmacht was receiving less than 30% of its required fuel supplies. Rations had been cut to starvation levels. Horses, which still pulled most German supply wagons, were dying faster than they could be replaced. Entire units were surviving on what they could forage or steal from the civilian population, a population that was itself starving. The contrast with American logistics was not merely quantitative but philosophical. The United States had constructed the most sophisticated supply system in military history, not just to win battles, but to maintain morale. American military doctrine understood something that the Germans had dismissed as soft. A well-fed soldier fights better than a starving one. This seems obvious, but Nazi ideology had convinced itself that spiritual strength, will, discipline, racial consciousness could compensate for material deficiency. It could not. A starving man with perfect ideology is still just a starving man. By Christmas 1944, the average American soldier in Europe was consuming 4,000 calories per day. The average German soldier was receiving, when supplies arrived at all, approximately 1,500. But the raw numbers tell only part of the story. The American rations included items that served no nutritional purpose. Chewing gum, candy, cigarettes. These were psychological provisions, meant to maintain the sense that the soldier was still connected to civilization, that even in combat he had access to small pleasures. The German ration, when it existed, was purely utilitarian: black bread, sometimes moldy, ersatz coffee made from acorns, fatty meat preserved in so much salt it was nearly inedible. The symbolism was crushing. Every K-ration box was a demonstration of American industrial capacity. The packaging alone, cardboard printed with instructions, wax paper to prevent moisture damage, a small wooden spoon, represented a level of manufacturing sophistication that Germany could no longer match. The cigarettes were Lucky Strikes or Camels, brand-name products manufactured in the millions. The chocolate was Hershey's, standardized and mass-produced. Even the matches were waterproof. Every detail communicated the same message. The side you are fighting against has so much industrial capacity that it can perfect the waterproofing of matches, while also building 300,000 aircraft and 80,000 tanks. Friedrich Becker held the can of ham and eggs that Sergeant Kozlowski had given him. He looked at it, then at the American sergeant, then back at the can. His mind struggled to process what was happening. This was the enemy, the terror bomber, the racial degenerate, the tool of Jewish capitalism, and this enemy was giving him food, not rotten food, not spoiled rations that had been rejected, but the same food the American soldier ate himself. There was no hierarchy here, no master and slave. Just one human being who had food giving it to another human being who did not. He took a bite. The taste of actual protein, of fat, of salt that was not overwhelming but balanced, hit his system like electricity. His body, which had been in semi-shutdown, suddenly remembered what it meant to be alive. He chewed slowly, carefully, because he knew that eating too quickly after prolonged starvation could cause vomiting. The 5 other German soldiers watched him. Kozlowski watched them all. Then, one by one, Kozlowski's squad opened their own K-rations and passed them to the German prisoners. This act, this simple, illegal, militarily unnecessary act of sharing food, contained within it the seeds of a revolution in consciousness, because food is not merely fuel, it is meaning. It is the substance through which humans have always expressed care, community, civilization itself. To share a meal is to acknowledge the humanity of the person across from you. To eat together is to create, however temporarily, a bond that transcends other divisions. The German soldiers and American soldiers sat in that frozen bunker and ate together. They did not speak the same language. They had been trying to kill each other hours earlier. But for the duration of that meal, the categories that had defined their relationship, enemy, Nazi, American, German, receded. What remained was something more fundamental. Humans eating, surviving together. One of the Americans, a private named Robert Martinez from New Mexico, offered a German soldier a cigarette. The German took it with shaking hands. Martinez lit it for him. The German inhaled deeply, held the smoke, exhaled slowly. "Dank," he said. Martinez did not speak German, but he understood the tone. He nodded. They smoked together in silence. After the war, Robert Martinez would tell his children about this moment. He would describe it as the first time he understood that the Germans were not abstractions but men like him, scared, cold, hungry, far from home. He would say that the shared cigarette taught him more about peace than any treaty or political speech. His children, growing up in the prosperous safety of 1950s America, would not fully understand what he meant. But Martinez remembered. He remembered that it was possible to hate an ideology, to fight a war, to kill when necessary, while still recognizing the humanity of individual human beings. And that this recognition did not come from education or propaganda, but from something as simple as giving a starving man a can of ham and eggs. The pattern repeated across the European theater. On New Year's Day 1945, near the destroyed town of Chenogny, American soldiers discovered a German field hospital that had been abandoned when the front line moved. Inside were 40 wounded German soldiers, some barely conscious, all starving. The American unit that found them was under orders to keep moving. The offensive into Germany could not slow for prisoners. But the soldiers, without being ordered, left behind their personal rations. One soldier, a medic named Thomas Fletcher, stayed behind for 6 hours to treat the German wounded, using his own medical supplies, before running to catch up with his unit. Fletcher was later reprimanded for this, but mildly. Even the officers understood that something about the situation demanded this response. Why? The official explanation was strategic. Demonstrating mercy encouraged German soldiers to surrender, which reduced American casualties. This was true but incomplete. The real reason, the one that appears in letters and diaries, was simpler and more profound. American soldiers fed German prisoners because not doing so would have required them to become the monsters their propaganda claimed the Germans were. To watch a man starve when you had food, to withhold medicine from the wounded when you had supplies, was to cross a line that defined something essential about what it meant to be American. This was not universal. There were American soldiers who committed atrocities, who shot prisoners, who treated Germans with brutal contempt. War is not a morality play, and individuals respond to its pressures in vastly different ways. But the dominant pattern, the one that emerges from thousands of individual incidents, was one of basic human decency asserting itself, despite the ideological framework that was supposed to prevent it. The Germans experienced this pattern as a form of cognitive warfare more devastating than artillery. They had been told for years that Americans were weak, decadent, capable of producing machines, but not of fighting with the spiritual strength that characterized the German soldier. They had been told that a multiracial army, with black soldiers and Jewish soldiers and soldiers whose grandparents came from Italy and Ireland and Poland, could never match the cohesion of the pure Germanic warrior caste. They had been told that democracy was inherently inferior to fascism because it valued individual life over collective purpose, comfort over sacrifice, material prosperity over spiritual strength. And then they were captured, and the Americans fed them, and the food was abundant. And the Americans who fed them included black soldiers and Jewish soldiers and soldiers with Italian last names. And these soldiers shared their rations without being ordered to, shared cigarettes, shared warmth, treated German wounded with the same care they gave their own. Every K-ration can, every chocolate bar, every cup of real coffee was a refutation of Nazi ideology more effective than any political speech. Friedrich Becker survived the war. He was processed through a POW camp in Belgium, then France, then was repatriated to Germany in 1947. He returned to a country that no longer existed in any meaningful sense. The cities were ruins. The currency was worthless. The political system had been completely dismantled. He found work as a carpenter in the Reconstruction, helping to rebuild the same buildings that Allied bombers had destroyed. He married, had more children, never spoke much about the war except to say that he had been lucky. But he kept one object from his time as a prisoner: The K-ration can that Sergeant Kozlowski had given him in that bunker on Christmas Eve 1944. He had cleaned it, removed the label, polished it until the tin shone. He kept it in his workshop for the rest of his life. When people asked about it, he would say only that it reminded him of the moment he learned that enemies could be human. The American military conducted extensive interviews with German prisoners after the war, trying to understand what had caused German morale to collapse so completely in the final months. The answers varied, but one theme appeared consistently: the realization that American material superiority was so overwhelming that continued resistance was not just futile but irrational. But beneath the statistics and logistics, beneath the talk of tanks and aircraft, was something more personal. German soldiers talked about being fed by their captors, about American soldiers sharing cigarettes, about being treated with a casual decency that contradicted everything they had been told about their enemies. One interview, conducted in May 1945, with a former Obergefreiter named Hans Müller, is particularly revealing. Müller had fought from Normandy to the Ruhr Pocket, had been a committed National Socialist, had believed until the very end that Germany was fighting for its survival. When asked what changed his mind, he did not talk about military defeats or Hitler's suicide. He talked about an American soldier who had given him a can of peaches after his capture. "I had not eaten fruit in 2 years," Müller said. "The American opened his ration, ate half the can, and gave me the rest. He did not have to do this. I was the enemy. But he did it anyway, and he smiled when he gave it to me. In that moment, I understood that everything I believed was a lie." The recurring symbol through all these accounts is the K-ration can. That small, rectangular container of wax-coated cardboard became the physical embodiment of American ideology. It contained not just food but abundance, more food than necessary luxury items that served no survival purpose, packaging that was ingeniously designed and wastefully disposable. It represented an economic system that could produce so much that even its soldiers in combat had excess to give away. And crucially, it represented a moral system in which sharing that excess with enemies was not seen as weakness, but as humanity. This was incomprehensible within the Nazi worldview. National Socialism was fundamentally predatory. Its entire logic was based on competition for scarce resources, on the strong taking from the weak, on racial hierarchies that justified exploitation. The idea that a soldier would willingly give food to an enemy prisoner, that this generosity came not from orders but from individual moral choice, that American soldiers did this routinely and casually. All of this suggested that there was a different way to organize human society. A way based not on domination but on cooperation, not on scarcity but on abundance, not on racial hierarchy but on individual dignity. The Japanese experienced a parallel revelation. In the Pacific Theater, American treatment of prisoners followed the same pattern despite the fact that Japanese propaganda had told soldiers that capture meant torture and death, that Americans were demons who would mutilate and murder surrendering troops. This belief was so strong that Japanese soldiers committed suicide rather than surrender, that wounded men would detonate grenades when Americans approached, that civilians on Okinawa threw themselves off cliffs rather than face capture. But those who did surrender, often because they were too wounded or weak to resist, encountered the same phenomenon German soldiers did. Americans fed them. American medics treated their wounds. Japanese prisoners in American camps received the same rations as American soldiers, sometimes better rations, because the Americans were uncertain about Japanese dietary needs and overcompensated. One Japanese soldier, captured on Iwo Jima in March 1945, later wrote that the first meal he received as a prisoner contained more protein than he had eaten in the previous month of combat. He described watching American soldiers eat their own rations and realizing that every American soldier ate like this every day, that this abundance was not exceptional but standard. This realization was spiritually shattering. Japanese military ideology was based on the principle that spiritual strength could overcome material deficiency, that the warrior's will was more powerful than the enemy's machines. But if the enemy had both machines and food, if American soldiers were well-fed and well-armed and still maintained morale, then what did that say about the spiritual superiority Japan claimed? The K-ration became a symbol of a different kind of strength, not the strength of deprivation and sacrifice, but the strength of abundance and generosity. The larger historical truth, the one that historians would spend decades analyzing, was that World War II was not won primarily through superior tactics or strategy, but through superior logistics undergirded by a fundamentally different economic philosophy. The Axis powers believed that war was about taking territory, taking resources, taking labor from conquered peoples. The Allied powers, and particularly the United States, demonstrated that war could be won by making so much that your soldiers never went hungry, making so much that you could feed your prisoners, making so much that abundance itself became a weapon. But beneath the economics was something more fundamental, a recognition that individual human life had value, that suffering should be minimized even for enemies, that civilization was measured not by how efficiently you could kill, but by how consistently you maintained moral principles even under pressure. American soldiers shared their rations with German prisoners, not because it was militarily necessary, but because doing so affirmed something essential about their own identity. To become the kind of person who watches another person starve when you have food would be to lose something more important than a battle. It would be to lose your humanity. This principle, born in frozen bunkers and muddy foxholes, would shape the post-war world in ways that neither side fully anticipated. The Marshall Plan, which rebuilt European economies, was predicated on the same logic. Abundance is not a zero-sum game. Prosperity can be created rather than taken, and helping former enemies recover serves everyone's interests. The same American soldiers who had shared K-rations with German prisoners became the occupiers who insisted on feeding German civilians, who pushed for economic reconstruction, who saw starving children and could not maintain ideological hatred in the face of actual human suffering. Friedrich Becker lived until 1992. He saw Germany rise from ruins to become one of the world's wealthiest nations, saw the Berlin Wall fall, saw the Cold War end. He saw his children and grandchildren grow up in peace and prosperity. In his final years, when dementia began to cloud his memory, he would sometimes hold that old K-ration can and tell the same story to anyone who would listen. About the Christmas Eve in a frozen bunker when an American sergeant whose grandparents had fled from Germany gave him food and, in doing so, gave him back his humanity. The story ended the same way each time. Becker would look at the can, turn it over in his hands and say, "I thought we were fighting for our survival, but the Americans taught me that survival is not the same as being alive. To be alive, you must be human. And to be human, you must recognize the humanity of others, even your enemies, especially your enemies." That K-ration can, polished and preserved, sits now in a small museum in Wurzburg, donated by Becker's family after his death. Visitors pass by it without much notice. It looks like any other piece of wartime debris, unremarkable, mundane. But in that unremarkable object is contained a truth that shaped the second half of the 20th century. That the greatest victory is not the one won on battlefields, but the one won in individual human hearts, when the categories of us and them dissolve in the face of shared humanity. That a single meal, given freely to an enemy in a moment of crisis, can transform hatred into understanding. That abundance, when shared, becomes something more powerful than any weapon. The snow still falls on the Hürtgen Forest every winter, covering the same ground where Friedrich Becker sat in a frozen bunker and learned that his enemies were human. The trees have grown back. The craters have filled in. The bunkers have crumbled. But the lesson remains, preserved in an empty can and in the memories of old men who learned it when they were young. That the measure of civilization is not how effectively you dehumanize your enemies, but how courageously you recognize their humanity, even when every pressure pushes you to do otherwise. And that sometimes, the most revolutionary act is the simplest one, sharing a meal with someone who should be your enemy, but who is, in the end, just another human being trying to survive in an inhuman world.